The show must go on.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event with Congressman David Price and Gene Nichol. I hope you can both see each other okay. We were having some Wi-Fi issues, so our solution is I have FaceTimed the congressman on my phone, and I'm holding up my phone so y'all can see him. Because we've spent some time with these technical difficulties, I think it might be easiest if you can each just introduce yourself, say a little bit about yourself, and then we can get started with the conversation and just jump into it because we don't want to spend any more time. Congressman, do you want to just introduce yourself real quick?
David Price, and I'm very appreciative to Flyleaf for setting this up and for sticking with us through these difficulties. Who knows? Here a year later, we still have these challenges. But anyway, thank you for hanging in with us, and Gene, thank you for agreeing to talk with me tonight about this book that I've just managed to finish here under interesting circumstances, the fourth edition of the Congressional Experience. And thanks to those who've tuned in. I appreciate your interest in the project.
David, it's great to see you. And it's nice to see the Flyleaf folks who are terrific. I'm Gene Nichol. I'm a professor at the law school at Chapel Hill. And I'm a big fan of our congressman and delighted to have a conversation with him about this book. I'll ask him a few questions, but I assume that, David, you'll start out by introducing us to the book for just a second, and then we can go back and forth. Is that all right?
Yes, that'll be fine. Lisa, my wife, is here with me. She says hello as well.
Okay. I was saying I have Lisa's phone number. I was about to call her. So.
All right, that might be the next step.
Right.
Well, this is the fourth edition of the Congressional Experience, which is a book I first wrote early in my term of service. I was elected first in 1986 in a very hotly contested election. I defeated an incumbent and then was challenged in those early elections pretty strongly. It was a swing district, to say the least, and I ended up losing one of those elections in 1994 and then making a comeback in 96. So soon after I first took office, a political science friend of mine, I come from an academic background, and political science friends of mine said, are you keeping a journal? Are you going to write up your experiences? And I thought, no, I'm really not keeping a journal, and I don't have much time or disposition to write up the experiences. But long story short, I decided to write an article and then the first edition of the book, which was mainly about what it's like to run for Congress and the kind of ins and outs of the in a swing district with in a state where we had pioneered negative campaigning thanks to Jesse Helms. It was a rough atmosphere, and these were rough races. And but I managed to make it, and then the very different political challenge of breaking in the House. I was a little better prepared for that because of my previous work as a staff member, but still, it was an interesting story, and it turned out for me to try to tell as well as to live through. So the book was at first wrote at the beginning of my third term. It was about my early experiences, and then came the electoral defeat and the comeback, and so that became the centerpiece of the second edition, and so it went. But I haven't done a new edition for 15 years. So the challenge of doing this edition was great. It is well over half a new book. It still has some of those early sections about getting elected and reelected and unelected. It still has some of that, but there's a lot more about becoming a more senior member, getting into House leadership, being in the minority and the majority, experience with various presidents, with various congressional leaders. A chapter now much more developed on foreign policy, simply because I've been able, as I became more senior, to get more involved in foreign policy in a serious way. And so And then there's the experience of the Trump presidency, the experience of growing House polarization because of what's happened in both parties, but especially in the Republican Party, as it's gone off in an extremely rightward direction, and it's become harder and harder to work in the old-fashioned a bill becomes a law kind of civics book fashion. So I'm chronicling that development, what it's like to legislate these days, and how to deal with some of the challenges of a polarized and much more partisan House, and then how to deal with the challenges of the Trump presidency, which are not totally new, but there's a lot there that's truly alarming, and that is a challenge to what I call the Article 1 branch of government, simply because that is what it is, and the constitutional challenges under Trump, amid other challenges, were quite serious, and they remain serious. The aftermath of the Trump presidency does nothing to alleviate the concerns I express in the book. So that's a bird's eye view of how we got to this edition. 15 years have gone by since the last edition. And there's a challenge as to when you say, okay, you take a snapshot and this is the way things are. I don't pretend to do that. I say from the beginning, this is an institution in transition. I will give the best account of the transition as I have observed and experienced it, but there's undoubtedly a lot more change to come.
Great. Thanks, David. And let me say that I'm guessing there's no one in a better position than David Price to write about the institution of the House, the long duration, and then the fact that you began as a very distinguished political science professor going in. So it makes for a great academic and political contribution, I think. I'm going to ask. I think I just want to ask maybe 3 or 4 questions. I want to start with one that's like an academic question, or like it's a question like I would ask if I was the kind of professor I used to be some years ago, which I've departed from a good deal. Now I'm folding into this first question, which is more technical. I did want to ask you, and maybe I thought I should ask Lisa, how in the world, I know something of what your schedule is like, and how in the world you could have written such a substantive and demanding book, given, David, even I go to enough Democratic events to know what your life is a little like. So, but you might begin with talking about how you did that, but the technical question I want to ask, it's not technical, but it's something that you write a good bit about that I've never thought about, which is the change in the operation of the House in your time towards centralization of power, particularly in the higher-ups, the Speaker and the like, which you make clear didn't start with Trump or Pelosi, but probably Newt Gingrich and earlier, kind of gathering power unto themselves. Gingrich did that, and then, as you write, Pelosi was not inclined to turn it back, and she's one of the strongest speakers in the institution's history, I would think. But it's meant that, as you point out, that something's lost in decentralization. So I think you said it's for a member like you were when you came, where you might get a foothold and have a bunch of projects to undertake and make a contribution even from a decentralized spot. That's much less likely now. The House operates in a much more centralized way, in part, you said, because of polarization, and in part because of reacting to emergency. So I thought it might be great for you to talk just for a little bit about what that has meant, the change in the operation of the institution, which has been wrought by more centralized powers in the speaker.
Right. Well, the first as to how to find time to do this, it is one reason it's been 15 years is that it's very hard to find time to undertake writing of this sort, especially if you have more leadership responsibilities as I've had as I became more senior and took on the chairmanship of an appropriations subcommittee and of the House Democracy Partnership, our parliament-to-parliament work with emerging democracies. So it is a major effort. It requires a lot of evenings when you'd rather not go upstairs and write. You go upstairs and write, and it's also true though, and I'm sure you've experienced this. I think anybody who writes about their experiences reflectively does experience this. You're thinking about things all the time, and kind of filing them away mentally. And so sometimes when it comes time to write things down, you aren't exactly starting from scratch. There's a certain mentality that you're always thinking about. Well, how do I interpret this, and how would I talk or write about it?
Mm-hmm.
The trend toward centralization in the House is it does go way back, and it even goes back beyond Gingrich, in the sense that when you and I were first learning about politics, we were concerned about the tendency of civil rights bills and aid to education bills and all kinds of good legislation dying at the hands of recalcitrant committee chairs. And the reason that happened was that the seniority system was ruled. The party control was overwhelmingly Democratic, and a lot of Southern conservative Democrats had stayed there longer than anybody else, and they were chairs of the major committees. Anyway, just to oversimplify somewhat, the more progressive forces, and I count myself that way, as among those when I was a young staff member, and then just starting out to participate and write about politics. It just seemed like the power of those committee barons had to be overcome in some way, and so reformers took on the strengthening of the party leadership as a way of wresting power from these committee leaders and putting it in the hand of the entire Democratic caucus. Meanwhile, of course, politics itself was changing, and the party in the South was becoming a biracial coalition, and those Southern committee chairs were kind of going the way of history, but in the meantime, there was a lot of pressure to hasten that process and to move them aside and to put the caucus in charge of its own legislative program. And so that's the story of what you might call responsible party reforms in the 70s, and the arrival of a lot of new liberal Democratic members at several elections along in that period hastened that along. So there had been some centralization of party powers before I got there, but the committee barons, people like John Dingell, Dan Rostenkowski, those committee barons, they weren't Southern conservatives any longer, but they still had a lot of power. And that's what Gingrich changed. I mean, Newt Gingrich changed things, first of all, within the Republican Party, took over from much more moderate, accommodating leadership. He radicalized the Republican Party. And then when he became Speaker, when they came into power after the 94 election, he did make the greatest changes in the speakership and in House organization since Uncle Joe Cannon back at the turn of the century. Mm-hmm. So, I talk in the book about some of the excesses of that Gingrich leadership. When Democrats regained control in 2007, as you said, Nancy Pelosi was not about to go back to the days of the committee barons, and I certainly didn't want her to. So she inherited a leadership with enhanced powers, and she exercised it, I would say, very skillfully, and exercised it with fewer excesses than what Gingrich had treated us to do. That's for certain. But still, it was not a return to the House that as it had been when I first got there, when the main way of legislating was kind of straight from the civics book. You introduce a bill. The bill gets committee consideration. Usually, there's bipartisan markup, an amendment of the bill, and then it comes to the floor, and it's a kind of one bill at a time, regular order sort of process, as we call it. That has become less and less common. It's much harder to pull that off in a polarized House where there isn't that prospect of bipartisan cooperation. And moreover, as I think you also said, the governing by crisis. I mean, there's a kind of it's a process that builds on itself. When it becomes more difficult to get legislation done, then things get pushed to the very end of the session. The appropriations bills get rolled into omnibus bills, and government shutdowns threaten. And so it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling thing as the regular order breaks down. Then there has to be stronger leadership to make sure that the lights stay on, or that major legislation gets done. So it is a much more centralized, leadership-driven process than it used to be, and part of that is the polarization. It's just harder to get a normal kind of cooperative process going these days. It's also a matter of crisis, as you said. Some are self-created crises. These budget crises create the need for centralized leadership. We appropriators, at the point that happens, we appropriations chairs look at each other and say, this has just gone above our pay grade. Because it's one thing to pass your appropriations bill through in the regular way. It's quite another thing to avoid a government shutdown and get the whole government funded in an omnibus bill. Pandemic adds to that in a big time way. The way we've operated over this last year has further enhanced the powers of leadership. I don't begrudge that. I think there is a loss in terms of the kind of contributions individual members can make, the kind of strength that came from a robust committee system. That system has some strengths, and it certainly has some pleasures for individual members who want to take on something and have an impact. So it's a different place now. But at the same time, if we're going to legislate under current circumstances, we simply cannot do it the old-fashioned way.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask a second question, which is less academic and more urgent, probably more bordering on the hysterical, which is more my cup of tea than yours, David. And I find that I'm obsessed with this right now, and I think it's the kind of issue of a lifetime for us. So I'm going to talk about it for just a second, give you a long time to answer. But then I think, Talia, we'll be able to open up the floor so that people have been waiting a long time. This is what I mean, David, right? Sort of addressing the growth and the now, I would say, predominance of the Republican Party, including the Republican caucus in the House, the North Carolina caucus, and the entirety of it, as an anti-democracy party with its own kind of seditionist wing, it seems to me. North Carolina folks have played a not insignificant role in that. Our support for Trump, the January 6th uprising, the anti-voting rights agenda. But we also have your former colleague Mark Meadows and Mulvaney, who were Carolina folks. Madison Cawthorn, your colleague, who sort of revved people up before the January 6th insurrection. Virginia Fox, who is your colleague, who introduced the motion and kind of taunted Liz Cheney. Mark Martin, the former Chief Justice of North Carolina, advising Trump on these matters. Sidney Powell, this crazy lawyer from North Carolina. 2/3 of the Republican House caucus voting to overturn part of the election, and roughly similar numbers joining on to that Texas lawsuit, and all of them being against an independent commission. These are folks, it seems to me, who are casting their lot against the American democratic experiment. We're sort of used to massive disagreements on facts and policies, but this is a rejection of the premise of the American experiment. And I don't want to overdo it, but I think it's not inaccurate to say right now in the United States we have one pro-democracy party. So given that, given the urgency of that, given the fact that we have these voting bills that are taking place all across the country, which are further going to jeopardize the American democracy, the worry that they can't be addressed by federal legislation unless something's done about the filibuster. Also, David, I'm a constitutional lawyer, as you know, and I have no confidence, I don't think a constitutional lawyer could, in the United States Supreme Court's willingness and effectiveness to push back these anti-democratic trends. And so, to me, the American democracy is on the line. I'm hopeful that your colleagues understand that as well as you do, and as well as a lot of folks across the country do. It's also the case that I think the Democrats in Washington owe it to the remarkable people who defeated Trump. And I think of that as people in the streets all over the United States. And if Democrats don't do everything that can be humanly done to protect their electoral interests, those people who elected Joe Biden and did the nation the great service of turning out a tyrant, then I think they're going to be rightly pissed and betrayed. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that and about whether your colleagues are well schooled in how high the stakes are, or maybe I'm just mistaken about that, but I'm pretty convinced, even if I'm wrong. So I was hopeful you might spend some time talking about that. It's beyond the scope of the book a little bit, or at least beyond the theme.
Yeah, I appreciate your bringing this up because it's clearly a crisis point, a kind of elongated crisis point for our democracy, and sometimes in an institution like ours, the appearances of normality are very, very deceptive. And I still have to remind myself that a good majority of my Republican colleagues voted against the peaceful transfer of power, voted to overturn a legitimate American election. They might not describe what they were doing in those terms, but as a matter of fact, that is what they were doing, and there has to be some accountability for that, some reckoning for that. I mean, we can't totally stop operating until it's dealt with. On the other hand, the notion that we would not have a commission to thoroughly explore the insurrection and the factors leading up to it is just astoundingly, well, it is it's beyond the pale, I think. And so you're right. This is territory that we've not experienced before. But it's, of course, the book pretty much concludes I put the book to bed in late summer.
Yeah.
But let me, what you're saying does lead me to say that all of this is not new, and there were warning signs. There have been warning signs for a long time that this was the way we were headed, and this is the way Trump was headed. I'll be brief, but I do want to just say that one thing I had to do in this new edition of the book is to write a separate chapter on our broken electoral system. I continue to have the brief accounts of my own campaigns and the ins and outs of that. But at the third chapter, I back away from that and say, all right, I've been through this. North Carolina's been through this. And North Carolina is remarkably in the middle of a lot of this, as you well know. Court decisions, the abuses, the voter suppression laws. When we're talking about extreme gerrymandering, when we're talking about voter suppression and the challenges to the Voting Rights Act, all of that is talked about in a separate chapter. I found I couldn't find a layman's account of that, actually, Gene, so I decided I'd write it myself.
Good.
And so that's what the third chapter is about, and it is a alarming story about going from unanimous renewal of the Voting Rights Act. Not that long ago. How long? 15 years ago?
Yeah.
To a remarkably obtuse Supreme Court decision that removed the pre-clearance function.
Right.
And dang, it wasn't more than a couple of weeks after that Supreme Court decision. In fact, it was a couple of weeks that Greg Abbott, he was then Attorney General of Texas, Greg Abbott had moved to move forward on a voter suppression program in Texas, and North Carolina moved very quickly. None of those would have survived pre-clearance. The things that the court said are targeted African Americans with surgical precision. None of that would have survived pre-clearance. So it's a remarkably quick and alarming abandonment of basic democratic values, small d democratic values, when it comes to the way districts are drawn, when it comes to the way politics is financed, and certainly when it comes to the way votes are, the right to vote is protected, and the right to have every vote counted is protected. So there's that, and that what's going on in all these state legislatures right now. Yes, it's reached a new level, but every bit of that is prefigured in what has happened in the last decade, and I do talk about that. And then I'd say the same thing about Trump. Obviously, we didn't anticipate the big lie and the second impeachment, but there was a first impeachment. There was a first impeachment, and I can tell you, it is not business as usual for a U.S. president to extort a foreign leader to do his political dirty work. It is not business as usual at all. And it is not business as usual for a president to do what Trump did in just flouting the Constitution and his constitutional duty to execute the laws of this country, to carry out duly appropriated, to expend duly appropriated funds. We had a government shutdown, the longest government shutdown in history, precipitated by Trump because we wouldn't appropriate funds for his border wall.
Right.
And finally, that 5-week standoff was resolved. But guess how it was resolved? It was resolved by Mitch McConnell agreeing to acquiesce in Trump's diversion of duly appropriated funds from the military, from all kinds of accounts, into that wall construction. I mean, some institutional defense. It was egregious, and so long before the last few months, of Trump's presidency, the die was cast, I think, in terms of his constitutional fidelity and his threat to democracy and the rule of law. We could say a lot more, but I do think it's fair to say that in the book and in what we can, it went through 3/4 of the Trump presidency. There's plenty of indications of trouble to come. There also are indications of how so much of this was prefigured by what the Republican Party did in the decade that preceded. And so I hope I've put all that in some perspective, because we need to understand both what was new about Trump and also what wasn't new, and what had some pretty strong precedents in the earlier work. He picked up Mick Mulvaney, his budget director, out of the House of Representatives, and you could figure out what Mick Mulvaney was all about long before he went to the Trump administration.
Right.
Picked out Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who had been trying to wreck the Iran agreement and really mess up in a big way Middle East diplomacy. You could figure out he was about before he went to the Trump administration. A lot of this shouldn't have totally surprised us.
Right. I'm sorry to say that Mick Mulvaney and this Sidney Powell and even Mark Martin are graduates of my law school. So, but we just won't talk about that. Talia, I have a lot more questions I'd like to ask David, but I'm worried about wearing out my welcome. So can you go to the folks who are wanting to ask questions?
Of course. And I apologize. I know I've been a little shaky. My hands.
You've been great.
But I appreciate everyone watching for just treating this as, business as usual, and not even acknowledging that I'm literally holding the congressman on FaceTime. I appreciate
David looks great. I wish I was in. I look better on a real small camera. So I also look better from long distance. I'm jealous of you, David. So.
Well, I'm happy not to have to hold, both of you up. I think that would be a little bit more difficult. Okay, so we do have a few questions from the audience. The first one comes from Lois, who says, do you think we will become a true three-party system with the Republican Party breaking into a Trump versus traditional GOP party?
Well, I'd welcome Gene's thoughts on this as well. I don't really expect that. I may be. The reading of American history would suggest, given our constitutional systems, lots of other things, there's a lot of biases toward two and only two major parties. Having said that, there are severe strains now within the Republican Party, and I don't know quite how they're going to be resolved. There's the distressing possibility that even given their performance, even given these strains and stresses, even given the looming presence of Trump, it's not out of the question that the Republicans could win next year's election. You would think there would be a chance under these circumstances, and the reasons that could happen have to do a lot with some of these political reforms Gene and I were referring to earlier, the way districts are drawn, the way voters are suppressed, the way lots of things are distorted in the electoral process. But I don't think it's going to happen. I'm hopeful that that we Democrats can and the president can perform at a level that the American people will approve, and that the kind of midterm expectations will not be met. But if they were to be met, if the Republicans were to find themselves back in control, they would have lots of ability to regroup with or without Trump. Maybe without Trump. I don't know. I expect Trump to fade, but then I've expected that before, and I just don't know. But I would not expect two more or less equivalent branches of the party to emerge from this. I think one or the other will predominate.
Yeah, I would just add very briefly, I don't expect that either, because you've got to have enough Republicans of character and commitment to the Constitution to actually cause a split instead of just the loss of 4 or 5 people at the edge. And we haven't seen any sign of that. Now, God knows I have undergone one transformation which I never thought humanly possible, which is to work up some admiration for Liz Cheney, which I will keep in abeyance, I promise. But waiting for Republicans to stand up for the American experiment at this point in time looks to be a fool's errand. So,
well, yes, I agree with that. There is though a legitimate or a real split, and I would venture to say that 9 out of 10 of my colleagues wish Trump would go away. So there are plenty of people who would like to see a Republican Party emerge that is not beholden to Trump. But I don't know that will happen. In any case, I don't expect you to end up with two equally strong factions. I think one or the other will predominate.
And the fact that it's a knowing departure from the American experiment and the centuries for which we fought for democratic traditions doesn't make it any more palatable, it seems to me. Whether they're literally clueless or simply knowingly departing from, these are the things that people have died for centuries, and they are abandoning them. This is not small measure, and it's something remarkable in the United States to become an anti-democracy party. I don't usually love Lyndon Johnson's speeches, but his famous speech introducing the Voting Rights Act, which begins with this is the only nation that was founded on an idea and a principle. And no one knows that better than David. But when you set aside democracy and government by consent of the governed and constitutional equality of participation, you're not just making a mistake, you are abandoning the American premise. You're abandoning what Lincoln said he fought the Civil War for. And that moves beyond error towards sedition. And it is very serious business. Talia, get me off of here and let someone talk to me.
Yes. Okay. The next question is from Terry. Terry asks, please share your thoughts on the 2-year term for Congress. It appears that more time is spent campaigning for re-election than attending to the work of the House. Would 4-year terms be more appropriate?
Well, most members of the House do occasionally look with envy at the longer terms of our Senate colleagues. On the other hand, boy, when Senate campaigns come, they really come. And Senate campaigns now are nationwide affairs with tens of millions of dollars and a lot of nastiness. And so I don't know that simply having the elections less often would do much to lessen the fundraising needs or the preoccupation with one's political standing. And in any case, the Constitution is not going to be changed, I think, to alter the 2-year term I used to teach American political thought in my senior times, and I remember that the debate in the Constitutional Convention was not 2 years versus 4 years; it was 2 years versus 1 year. and the folks from Massachusetts had a saying where annual terms end, tyranny begins. The idea was to keep members of the House on a very, very short leash. So thank goodness we don't have 1 year terms. But
yeah, and they had to ride a railroad from Montana.
there are times I've been very grateful for the 2 year term, namely when I've lost. When Ike Andrews was defeated in '84, I was able to jump right in and turn the seat around in '86. When I lost myself in '94, I had a comeback going within 3 months. And so I say that somewhat flippantly. I realize you could debate this probably in a more principled way, but it's somewhat hard to do that, knowing how unlikely it is that this would be changed, and how deeply ingrained that sense is that the House is the body that's most responsive to popular sentiment.
I remember Ike Andrews days. We're probably the only two people on this call who were old enough for that. Tali, why don't you go to the next question?
All right. Let's see. This is from David. Could you speak to the challenges of intra-party negotiations with wide ideological diversity within the Democratic Party, an extremely narrow margin, and the general demonization of the concept of compromise as, quote, selling out on principles?
Great question.
With the focus, I presume, being on intra-party negotiations.
Right, within the Democratic Party.
Right. Well, it's a challenge, but it's not an insuperable challenge, and it's nothing compared to the challenge the Republicans have. There's a chart in the book. Let me see. I have a copy here. I'll just quickly refer. There's a telling chart in the book about the ideological distribution of House members, and it's in. I won't find it here. Here it is. All right, I'll do it about it. It's page 155, and what it shows is the left to right distribution of Democrats and Republicans in the House from the 60s until the present day. And what you find is that both parties have become more homogeneous and more ideological. The Democrats have become more uniformly liberal or progressive. The Republicans have been more uniformly conservative. But interesting turn in the last decade. The Republicans have gone further and further to the right, and actually the Republican graph is less peaked now, which is to say the more conservative members are just constantly creating problems for Republican leaders. And I tell the story in the book about how John Boehner, speaker, ran afoul of that. He's written a book about himself recently, about where he I wish I had some of those salty quotes to put in the book about his difficulties with.
I thought your book was better though, Dave. More lasting contribution.
So the Republicans have much greater ideological extremism and a much greater difficulty in governing and in pulling together a coherent position on anything than we do. Having said that, we have our challenges as well. I write in the this is not directly on point, but there is a segment in the book on foreign policy, and I talk about the movement in the Democratic Party toward a more liberal position, and I relate that to Middle Eastern politics, and that has come up recently because there's been a lot of commentary about how divided Democrats are on Middle Eastern questions and how divided we were with respect to this recent conflict in with Gaza. And I said to a number of reporters, look, yes, there are some divisions, but the real story is how the caucus as a whole has moved in a fairly uniform direction towards supporting two-state diplomacy, towards supporting the Iran nuclear agreement, and towards supporting a restoration of America as a fair arbiter in Middle Eastern politics. And I think that's true. I think the main story is that the Democratic caucus as a whole has moved, and that there's actually that's a much more interesting and significant story than what you might conclude about people at the extremes or people who have less mainstream positions. So that's probably true in a lot of areas. Now our margin is very close right now, and we have some very big challenges ahead. Of course, it couldn't be closer than the 50-50 Senate, but the challenges in the House are major enough. And we had a close call the last week we were in session a couple of weeks ago, and guess what it involved? You wouldn't have thought this would be a flashpoint, but it was the bill appropriating funds for the security of the Capitol in the aftermath of January 6th. And we had some members on the progressive end of the spectrum in our party who really didn't want to vote for having said that they were voting for police funding or for that much police funding. Even though some of those members are some of the ones most in need of police protection. I don't want to go into that except to say that even an issue like that, where you'd think we wouldn't have divisions, we had divisions. So I'm not minimizing the challenge of holding our caucus together, but I'd a lot rather have our problem than have their problem when it comes to achieving internal coherence and unity.
Talia, I looked and there are at least two good, strong questions left in the box, so you ought to go to those.
Of course. Okay. So this is from, let's see the name. Okay, Daniel. Daniel says, how have the events of January 6th changed your outlook on the health of American democracy, especially when a sizable portion of House Republicans voted against the certification of the results? Also, are you worried about what might happen if Republicans take the House in 2022 and hold it in 2024, but Biden wins re-election? Because that could provoke a constitutional crisis if they fail to certify a Biden re-election.
All of that is perfectly legitimate concern, as Gene has articulated very well, and I share that. One of the I stressed earlier how much of the voter suppression menu was prefigured. It's not new now. It's just being pushed with more vigor. But there is one element. There is one element that's added to these voter suppression bills that is very ominous, and this is what the question refers to, and that is taking legitimate powers to adjudicate elections away from state authorities, more neutral, more objective state authorities, putting them in the hands of legislators. Things that you wonder if they had been in place, might have actually led a legislature or two to overturn the popular vote in their state. I don't think that's out of the question. I hope it is still a real stretch in this country, but it is very, very worrisome that the Republican Party has gone as far as it has in not just humoring Trump, not just cutting him a little slack, but actually going over the cliff with him, and now continuing to perpetuate the big lie and a lot of changes in electoral system that are predicated on that. So yes, I worry a great deal about what a Republican victory would mean in the states and nationally in 22, and certainly what this might. The system is really in a bad way by virtue of the electoral college. I mean, we have a lot of things wrong, even when our system's working well. We have a lot of things that distort electoral outcomes and that undermine legitimacy, even when it's working well. And actually, it did work pretty well. In most states, it worked quite well. The election was remarkably free of fraud and so forth. But when the idea is perpetuated and believed by 2/3 of the adherents of a major party that elections are rigged, especially if they lose the elections, then that clearly could spell future trouble.
Yeah, I would just add that these are not fanciful. It seems to me the most reasonable way to read this new Georgia law is that they have given the legislature power to do what couldn't be done when Trump outrageously demanded that the election be delivered to him. They took away the power of the Secretary of State, and then they awarded the authority of the legislature to overturn the election. That begins by saying Trump wasn't able to destroy the election last time. We want to make sure that you could the next time. And we know, as David has pointed out, we know from 10 years in North Carolina that these folks will do this. They will work to demolish the American democracy. I'm an old constitutional lawyer. We all used to believe that we agreed on the fundaments. We would fight on policy, fight on economics and the like, but we believed in the operation of democratic decision making. That's turned out to be naive, and we could still lose this in the very short term.
Okay, let me check the questions. It looks like there's only one more question, and that's from Iris. And Iris says, can the Democrats organize a commission dealing with the January 6th insurrection without Republican support? Is that possible?
Short answer is yes, we can, and we will. It is not going to have the same kind of nonpartisan legitimacy that it would have had if it had been a commission on the 9/11 model. So I think it's really alarming that the Senate voted that down, and I think there's no equally legitimate substitute, and of course that's exactly why they voted it down. Having said that, though, there now will be and must be an investigation, and I think it has to be an investigation beyond the normal committees of the Congress. There could be a special committee. I guess that's the most likely outcome. A select committee that would have it would be members of both parties, but it would have a Democratic chair. There could be a presidentially appointed commission. My colleague Jerry Connolly has proposed that, thinking that there are precedents for presidentially appointed commissions where, of course, the president would have to bend over backwards in ensuring the fairness and objectivity of those appointees. And even if he did, he'd be accused of stacking the commission. And that's the unfortunate part about this. No matter how we do it, no matter how hard we work at it, it would be portrayed from the start, I think, by Trump and by many Republicans as a stacked commission, and therefore its findings would be suspect. So we will move ahead with this. There will be an investigation, but I think it's a real loss not to have the commission that would be operating on the 9/11 model.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't have anything to add to that. I think we probably ought to let the congressman go to his dinner. Don't you think so?
All right. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I want to just thank both of you again, and thank you both so much for your patience. Thank you to everyone watching for your patience dealing with this odd technical difficulty. And I guess the show must go on. And I appreciate everybody who's stuck around and listened regardless. Few quick reminders. We have signed copies of the Congressman's book, the Congressional Experience, 4th edition. Those are available at Flyleaf. You can click the link just below our faces, or you can come in and shop in person. We also have Gene's books, Indecent Assembly and The Faces of Poverty in North Carolina available, and those are both at the link, the green link just below our faces as well. We have a bunch of other events coming up. If you want to go ahead and click on our Flyleaf Books logo, and you can see everything we have on the calendar. They're not all like this, I promise. In terms of, I'm not always holding someone on FaceTime, but I think all things considered, we did a pretty good job tonight. If you have already purchased your copy, but you want to support the store, we appreciate you coming in and buying any other books, of course, or there's a little donate button below our faces. If you want to send us a couple dollars, we do appreciate that, and it helps support our programming. All right, I think that's everything I have for tonight. Thank you again to both of you. Thank you, Congressman Price. Thank you, Gene Nichol, and thank you to everyone for watching. Have a good night.
Thanks a lot.
Goodbye.
Bye.